So thank you for joining us for this Spark News Media event into Women in Leadership. With me, I have Phumzile Mlambo Ngcuka, and I'm so delighted to be able to speak to her today, one of the groundbreaking politicians of her era. And it really is an honor for me to speak to you. It feels like your job has never been more important, never been more pressured, and probably never been harder. Do you think that's an accurate representation?
Yeah, no, definitely. It's gotten complicated. Before COVID, we were already projecting that we were not going to reach our objectives, the objectives of the SDGs, and that we needed to accelerate the interventions. And with COVID, it just changed everything. What was already a pressured proposition became even worse.
Do you? I mean, this is an incredibly high profile and high pressured, I imagine, role. How, after a year that must have been utterly exhausting for you, how are you feeling about, how would you assess where women find ourselves at the end of 2020?
But let me just say that if you just reflect over the last 25 years, where we have seen that there had been significant change as a result of the Beijing platform of action and the implementation of that, because that provided, if you like, a common platform for nations to do something about gender equality, whereas before that there was nothing that was forcing countries to work together to be accountable about what they were doing or not doing for women. The Beijing, in the same way that the Charter in the United Nations holds nations together. They may not all implement the Charter to the best of their ability, but the fact that no nation has ever opted out helps, it lifts everybody. That is what the Beijing Declaration did. So we saw countries making strides in girls' education, especially those who started from the bottom. They never got to address everything that needs to be addressed, but it's something that is in motion. Women's health, there was a targeted focus to address women's health that you saw maternal fatalities decreasing, with some challenges along the way, but it was going the right direction. Labor absorption increasing, countries enacting laws that address gender equality and therefore ensuring that women's rights are protected in law. So, but that what that created was significant changes, but not deep enough.
Right.
Not even enough, not fast enough. Come COVID, all of the weaknesses in the change that we've been experiencing was laid to bear.
Sure.
And in those areas where we were making changes, it just seems to be just those 8 areas that COVID is hitting hardest. Girls' education. We stand to lose girls out of school, girls being married off at a faster rate, something that we had been fighting in the last 25 years, and we're beginning to see that we're going forward. And the absence of infrastructure to enable long-distance learning and digital learning means that in those communities where the girls' education drive was most important, then they have a new setback now to take them back. Women's health, the inaccessibility of health facilities because of all the considerations that have to do with COVID, including shifting money for women who need chronic medication antiretrovirals, access to places for safe delivery, access to contraceptions. All these areas where we were making progress, we now are hit hard. I'm like, why is the universe against us? So, so it's been that this really a big tension. And of course, labor absorption, it's not been grand, but certainly some progress in some countries, Latin America, for instance. But most of the jobs that are being lost under COVID are jobs that women had in the social sector,
Yes.
in the service sector, in tourism, etc. And because in many countries, these jobs are not really covered in labor law.
Yes.
Women do not have enforceable rights with their employers. And the chances are that they will not go back to pre-pandemic levels of employment. So again, we have to go back to the drawing board on labor absorption. And if you look at the fiscal stimulus that are there, are not quite well targeted to women. And a stimulus without the underlying macroeconomic structural change does not do it, because by its nature, fiscal stimulus are meant to address short-term emergencies. They are not fixing, underlying issues that need other interventions, from policy to programs. So right now, part of what we were asking, what has it been like, battling to bring the stimulus to come together with program, to direct them for women, to give governments data about the situation of women in their own countries, what's happening to women in the informal sector, and the need to respond there. And of course, the violence, which has been reported, that, it is a shadow pandemic.
If ever there was a moment to make us realize how far we have to come, this is the moment, isn't it? Because we feel like those hard-earned gains were perhaps
brittle,
not built on as firm a foundation as we might have thought. It also brings into sharp relief, doesn't it, just how vitally important it is that, to come to the theme of what we're talking about today, how important it is to have women in roles of leadership.
Yeah.
In your opinion, has there been sufficient recognition of the gendered impact of COVID in governments throughout the globe?
It's uneven. I think it's fair to say that there are a number of, or even when there is recognition, the actions that are taken are not equal to the challenge that we are facing. So, for instance, 144 countries responded to the Secretary General's call on dealing with violence, which we saw increasing during COVID. But the fact that those government, 144, acknowledged that this was a problem. You do not have 144 countries who have changed their strategy drastically in response. I think the point I'm always making about this issue of violence against women is that it is a pandemic in its own right. And we now know what it takes to fight a pandemic. We have seen it with our own eyes, something that we've never known. We know that if you are a pandemic, as a government, you take drastic steps. You close borders. You restrict people from traveling. You have health workers working around the clock, risking their own lives. We've never seen anyone risking their own lives to save women from violence. If a woman presents with a life-threatening partner, she has to answer all kinds of irrelevant questions. When someone presents with a COVID, we know what to do. She gets the medical attention that is needed, and nobody asks, where were you infected? What were you doing? So there is therefore a challenge of not taking the issues that affect women serious enough, and therefore mounting a fight that is as big as the issue. I mean, our frontline workers in gender-based violence are magistrates, police, social workers, judges. I don't think they're working around the clock in order to make sure that they create conditions where we both prevent as well as prosecute successfully crimes against women. So there is something there that we need to do, to use this time of COVID to show these examples and the stark difference of the way we are dealing with issues that could be as serious as well, and are deserving of the agency and the significant attention that we are able to give to other issues.
Why do you think there is this lack of urgency among governments?
The lack of leadership of women at the most strategic places, you know. So increasing women's leadership is something that would definitely change, and a critical mass of women who would be able to take decisions without having to refer to somebody. The fact that women are not, in many cases, the ones with the final say means that their decision making and their choices of interventions that is needed still need to be underwritten.
Yes.
And negotiated elsewhere. And also, we don't have women everywhere where we need them, because gender inequality happens everywhere. And generation equality as a multi-stakeholder forum brings together people in different spaces where there are decisions to be taken, so that they, in the space that they're in, can take the right decision and response, whether you are in the private sector space, whether you are youth, whether you are government, whether you are civil society, whether you are a traditional leader, a religious leader, or just an ordinary person. We are trying to provide, in generation equality, a comprehensive way of responding that empowers everybody wherever they are to be a change maker in their own right, so that this is not something you can specialize in. UN Women is too small to be everywhere and to make the push that is needed for the system to patriarchy to crumble. Yeah.
I mean, that's what we're talking about, isn't it? Like, if we really are going to see this, if we are going to face what is really happening, then it requires more than tinkering around the edges.
Oh, yeah.
It requires a fundamental overhaul of the entire system. In your view, is there any sense that there is a willingness to do that, or do you see any hope in any examples of countries where they are moving towards that direction?
I don't want to be discouraged, because it's not as if countries are doing nothing. They're just not doing enough. I'm always using this example of 25 years ago, where we started, just so that we can have a sense of the journey traveled. We had maybe about 10 countries which had legislation that addresses gender equality. Now we have 144 countries, and 25 have also amended their constitution. So that is significant, because it protects all the women in those countries, because when you change legislation, you are providing a dispensation for everybody. And the changes in the laws that has happened has covered more than 2 billion women. But guess what? There's still about 2 billion women who also lives in jurisdiction where some of their rights are not covered in law. Some countries, as much as 75% of their rights are not covered in law. But yes, we've seen countries addressing critical changes in law, family law, custody, inheritance, acquisition of assets. So all of those have made a difference in women's lives. But we still have many more countries, and sometimes we change one law, but there's another law that takes away what you have just given. So it's then finding a way in which you could actually have an overhaul of laws, legal reforms that overhauls everything. In this phase that we're in now, countries are beginning to do that because we've gone back to them and say, you know what, we're going in circles.
Yeah.
And we're taking too long. So you have a country like Gambia just saying, I submit, overhaul all my laws and look everywhere to see that I do not have a laws that reinforce what I think I am just trying to solve in another law. And this is the way to go. And we see that when a few countries start to do something, it does put pressure on the other countries. Say, for instance, the issue of burden of care on women. For as long as I've been an activist, we have been fighting to make this a critical issue, to show that the time use of women works against the objectives that we have for women, because women spend too much time doing things that do not benefit them but benefits everybody else. Their labor is free, and therefore they are the shock absorbers of failing economies and lapse in administration and planning and budgeting. Women make that up by showing up and doing these unpaid, providing these unpaid care services. COVID showed that clearly. 106 billion children out of school at home. Guess who was there? Girls and women. And this continues also because of people being sick, not being able to go to health facilities, and old people needing care.
Yeah.
And for the first time, I have seen many governments wanting to address this issue of unpaid care. What do we do to redistribute it, to regulate it, as well as to see that women can also be paid for care, for unpaid care? This is one of the issues that in generation equality we seem to be in a good space to address effectively. And you had pockets of the more progressive government looking at the issue, but they were far and few in between. Now we have a chorus of countries, even in the way they are deciding about their social protection. They want to make sure that it addresses the issue of the burden of care. They also recognize that the absence of care infrastructure and policies takes women away from the labor market, and it's hitting the younger women because the air of reproduction and production that happens at the same time. The biological clock is such when you're having babies is when you enter the labor market, and having to force women to make a choice between these two is just a false choice. That is unacceptable. So again, as you were asking, am I seeing change? There is a glimmer of hope. Now the World Bank also is hammering governments about having to address the burden of care on women. The IMF is calling for governments to address the issue of the burden of care. So you have this perfect storm of different institutions arriving at this point, at this time. But how long? It has taken us so many years to get to this point where you do not have to be convincing everybody, where people now are saying, so what do we do? Where do we move to from here?
But can we be confident that in a world where many economies have suffered hugely and will continue to suffer as we come out of this pandemic, you know, the utopia of universal childcare, of affordable, high quality childcare, that, and viewing childcare as infrastructure, not as something that's nice to have. Do you feel like that may, and in the UK, certainly that's how it feels at the moment. Our childcare sector has been very badly hit, and there is no mention of it in the higher echelons of power. Does it feel like that might be one of, you know, it just falls down the list of priorities?
Oh yes. You know, usually when there are austerity measures of one sort or the other, social programs, and most of the time social programs that benefit women tend to be sacrificed as resources are being shifted to do something else that is regarded as more important. But again, in a strange way, COVID has also shown us what is essential. Many of the things that have become essential services are not the thing that economists in high places would more 2 years ago sit and discuss, that people who work in places where we buy food, that's an essential worker. These are the people who are underpaid. People who clean hospitals and manage hospitals, for that matter, even health workers. If you look at the way they are rewarded, it doesn't tell you that these are essential workers. So sometimes in a time of crisis, that's when you can sneak in change that is dramatic. But I mean, I don't want to be over optimistic and say the penny has dropped in all cases, but we certainly have been introduced to vocabulary and experience of everybody in the world, because this pandemic happened to everybody. In every country, we were experiencing the same things. Of course, those that are in the worst affected and poor countries, it was even harder. But we all have an idea of the impact of this discrimination that is so entrenched in our society.
We were also so much in the home. It's very difficult to ignore what happens in the home when you are just in the home so much.
Absolutely. Yeah.
In your view, is that where in countries where there is a higher female participation in civic society and in politics, or where we have strong female leaders both in politics or in other fields, have those countries performed better, and B, performed in a more gender inclusive way?
You know, a combination of women in leadership. You know, whether you're talking New Zealand or the Nordic countries where they have female heads of states. The state of Kerala in India, just that state with a health minister who was a woman who was leading from the front of the pandemic. Certainly, we have seen a more engendered response, but also not just an engendered response, a people-centered response, where there was a focus on both fighting from the health side, dealing with the issues of just the needs of people, and at the same time looking at the economic issues at a macro level, a combination of that, and not bringing politics into it, and being inclusive in terms of decision making and working with everybody, working across political parties, etc. So there's something to be said about women who were in leadership, but also in countries where civil society is organized and is able to be strong advocates, to stand up and to call on the leaders, even if the leaders are not women. We have had those voices. I mean, in my country, South Africa, women were as loud as anything. It's a country with a strong civil society that was able to call for the kinds of changes and interventions that they need. Not that they got everything, but certainly they made a difference. Or you look also in countries like Kenya, again, women were up on their feet calling for the changes. And some countries in Latin America monitoring, that is where we saw also a lot of countries looking at the issue of the burden of care, because civil society was so loud about it. And of course, I think everywhere in the world where civil society is active, the issue of girls' education is certainly occupying everyone's, because I mean, another lost generation we can't afford.
Absolutely. And with bearing that in mind, if we have, we have these positive examples, both in the political sphere and in civic society, how can we improve that engagement, and how do we pave the way for women to take a more active role in the decisions that affect their lives?
I think we should not stop. Our activism has been renewed and we've been given a greater sense of urgency, and we must not associate this with the pandemic. This is our life, pandemic or no pandemic, because any slowing down or reduction of the pressure would just mean that we go all the way back to levels of inadequacy that even is worse than what was there before the pandemic. So staying focused and engaged, and then consolidating our demands, because there's one thing that has also come out is just the similarities that are there in many countries. And again, I come back to why we want generation equality to be a global campaign that involves everybody on a few of the issues that we think can be game changers if they're addressed. It is because we recognize that there is no one country that can handle this alone. Governments have to hear this from everybody everywhere. And we should use the multilateral system as a platform where we bring these issues, because that is where all of them come together.
So this is really the moment. It's do or die.
This is really the moment. I thought I was getting ready to retire. I recognize that this is
no way.
This is not the time. We do need, though, to bring in young people. Their radical impatience is refreshing, and their perspective and expectations from life, which I think is less forgiving than ours, is also a critical advantage that we need.
How do we make this everybody's fight? How do we make this so it's not just women shouting these things and being ignored?
Yeah, well, that is also part of what we're doing. Calling for instance, this is not violence against women. This is men's violence against women. This is men's problem. So they have to sort it out. We are also, just this morning, I was in a meeting with the ministers of finance of a few selecting countries that have worked on their fiscal stimulus, Bangladesh, Jamaica, Ethiopia. And the message was, I don't want to speak to the women of gender on these issues, because they are struggling themselves to get the kind of attention that they need. This is an issue that requires the ministers of finance. to deal with them, because it is a budgetary issue, just like any other issue on the budget. Why do I have to speak to the Minister of Gender, who does not have the money? We have to go to the people who actually are the ones who have the resources, so that we are campaigning for the ministers of gender to be better resourced. Otherwise, they are not able to make the kinds of changes that we expect them to make. It's also an issue of heads of state. When Corona happened, this was not just left to the ministers of health. It was a serious issue, a pandemic. It was all of government, and heads of states were leading from the front. To the extent that the issue of gender inequality, which includes a threat to life, is also a pandemic. You cannot give it just to one person.
And this next year that we're going to have the Generation Equality Forum, are you confident that it will go ahead for a start? And can you assure us of that? And what can we look forward to?
It's definitely going to go ahead. I've got the paper, they've signed.
Great news.
And also, they're participating. All the different stakeholders are participating. We have got dates and all of that. But I mean, the important is not just the forum itself where we get together, is what we will be bringing to the forum. So the 6 themes that we're working in will determine the kinds of actions that we would have agreed to take. So what you can expect is, what are we going to do different on violence against women, which is one of the themes. Economic justice, we will tackle the issue of care in economic justice, because it's crippling us. We will tackle the issue of macroeconomic policies that are responsive to women under economic justice. We are dealing, another theme is climate, women and climate justice. We will look at the different ways in which the way we deal with climate change impacts on women. The other issue is SRHR. Again, the accessibility of services that women need in order to make sure their reproductive rights and health needs are addressed adequately. So that's another theme. And innovation and technology is another theme, and women's leadership. So we will, in Beijing, we had 12 themes of action. We consolidated now these themes of actions because it's always difficult when you have too many topics. But try to make sure that in these 6 themes, we touch on the issues that really are catalytic. And so we have private sector there, we have philanthropists, we have young people, we have universities, we have governments, we have regional bodies from AU to EU.
I would love to ask you, because you are such a trailblazer, the first female deputy president in your country. What was the best piece of advice anyone gave you as a political leader?
You know, it's when you are on a platform, the platform that you have been given, make sure that when you enter into any meeting, have an objective to use every moment to push something, because that moment will never return. And you may not get what you want at that moment, but you may plant a seed so that you follow up at another time or at another platform. So I guess it is, and the message was, to be in leadership is about using every opportunity, not as a nice to meet, but as a nice to do. Push every button that you can push wherever you are.
That's incredible. Phumzile, I think that's us. We're out of time.
Thank you.
But It has been an absolute honour to speak to you.
Yeah.
Thank you for being such a trailblazer. Thank you for showing the way for so many other women, and thank you for fighting the good fight every day.